Hello, you're watching World Talks on TVP World. My name is Sasha Farbach. After a wave of Russian strikes targeted the Sumy and Odessa regions of Ukraine overnight into Wednesday, casualties are being reported, which include at least 6 people injured in Sumy. There have also been damage to residential areas and energy infrastructure across multiple regions, including repeated attacks on Naftogaz facilities in Chernihiv. The developments come amid broader security concerns, including Belarus's shift toward rotational mobilization and reported intelligence claims of Chinese training support for Russian troops. We'll now discuss all the latest with our guest, Rostyslav Khotin, senior editor for the Ukrainian Service, RFE-RL. Thanks for being with us. Good morning.
Hello, Sasha.
I want to ask about these strikes. We've already heard that there have been casualties, various areas. I'm curious also about the actual infrastructure damage done here. If we're looking at Naftogaz, how significant is that, and Russia stepping up in this direction?
Yeah, for the third day running, Russia has been targeting Ukrainian energy infrastructure yet again. Especially infrastructure belonging to the state oil and gas giant Naftogaz Ukraine. Today there was a strike against Naftogaz infrastructure in the northern Chernihiv region. The day before in the central eastern Dnipropetrovsk region, before again Chernihiv region. So it seems that Russia wants to knock out Ukrainian energy infrastructure yet again. But now it's not during winter period, of course, but in the when hot summer is approaching, because of climate change, summers are now very hot in Ukraine, and people are using air conditioning quite actively, both in the offices and in private housing as well, both in the private houses and also in apartment blocks. You can see in Ukraine that people put air conditioners outside of their balconies and windows. And Russia wants to make sure that Ukrainians are struggling during the hot summer as well, but also its preparation for the knocking out Ukrainian energy infrastructure before the winter period as well. So Russia started attacks against energy infrastructure well before winter and before hot summer is approaching. That's one thing. Another thing is strikes continue also against Ukrainian civilians. This night, the city of Dnipro in central eastern Ukraine was targeted. 2 people were killed. Also, Sumy in northeastern Ukraine, Odessa in the south near Black Sea. Yesterday, there was a powerful missile strike against the town of Preluki in Chernihiv region in the north. 4 people killed. So Russia continues targeting both civilians and deliberately targeting energy infrastructure before hot summer is approaching, because people, as I said, quite actively using air conditioning in the summer.
Yeah, and I think we report a lot about how that affects the winter. But as you said, I remember about this some weeks ago, about the water strikes and also trying to cripple that for Ukraine. Let's also talk about what Ukraine is doing as a response to this. Also from Ukrainian media, we're hearing that there have been several bombings from drones from the Ukrainian side into the southern, if you look at the map, southeastern Ukraine and the Donbass, looking at Donetsk and also Zaporizhia, that corridor. Ukrainians have been bombing Russian forces and areas there. How much of an impact will that have in terms of logistics for the Russians, especially looking into as they ferry things into Crimea?
You know, the thing is that Ukrainian precise strikes against Russian energy infrastructure, especially oil sector, oil exporting sector, oil refineries in Russia, and also oil depots on the Russian soil were quite successful. I mean, why Ukraine is targeting oil infrastructure in Russia? Because oil is the source of Russian hard cash revenue for the state budget, which then allocated to the military purposes, to finance Russian armed forces which are involved in aggression against Ukraine. So Ukrainian officials underline that it's a legitimate target to target the Russian oil infrastructure. And indeed, on the maximum level, almost half of Russian oil refining industry capacities were damaged by Ukrainian drone strikes in Russia. Russia, of course, quickly repairs them, and from 50% to 30% they reduced the damage, then to 20%. But nevertheless, Ukraine made sure that Russia will not export as much oil as it wants to, and especially when the war in the crisis around Iran and in Hormuz area of Gulf Bay still continues. So the idea is to scrap Russia of oil revenues when in the time of Iranian crisis, Russia's earning too much.
Right, and that is key, and I think Ukrainians call this sometimes kinetic sanctions against Russia. But I was curious more about what Ukraine is doing on those occupied territory areas, like I mentioned, from Donetsk south into then almost into Crimea there. We've heard reports on Ukrainian media. Do you think that's going to also, let's say, choke up the Russians a bit, or is that too early to tell?
Yeah, it will choke up Russians quite significantly, because Ukraine definitely considers occupied Crimea and occupied parts of Donbass and southern Ukraine as there are no questions about legitimacy. When there are strikes against the infrastructure or targets on the territory of the very Russian Federation, then Ukraine wants to kind of justify it, to explain it, kind of to legitimize it. But when Ukraine strikes targets on the occupied parts of Ukraine, it provides no explanation. It's like 100% legitimate targets. And Ukraine have been striking military targets, arms depots there, airfields, some kind of service centers for Russian occupying army there. But also not just occupied parts of Ukraine. In recent days, Ukraine made the strikes against military boats on the Caspian Sea. It's quite far away from Ukraine. And several Russian boats and several Russian small military naval ships were targeted and damaged quite significantly. So Ukraine proves that it's able to target military installations, military targets quite far away from Ukraine, even on the Caspian Sea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also on that, I want to kind of extend it a bit. I know I'm short on time here. There's a report, according to Reuters here, that they've seen, apparently documents by 3 European intelligence agencies, that there have been 200 Russians that have been apparently trained by China. Now, I'm just curious of your mind if that is indeed true. I mean, China said it's not involved in the war. What do you make of that development?
China pretends to be neutral, but apparently in July 2025, Russian and Chinese military, they signed a deal on training of 200 Russian soldiers by China, mostly in Beijing and in the eastern Chinese city of Nanjing. Apparently, they were trained to target with drones, for drone training, but also to intercept drones. Anti-drone and anti-drone training they received in China. And some of them are already back to the front lines in Ukraine on the Russian side. Although China pretends that it's kind of unbiased and neutral, and now Putin is in China, and Chinese leader Xi Jinping again underlined that Chinese stance is neutral and unbiased. But apparently, of course, China supports Russia both politically, diplomatically, but also providing dual-use goods for Russia, which chips and later used in the military production. And also with new reports about training of Russian soldiers. That's puts China in a quite awkward position, because where is your neutrality if you support Russia, and you train Russian military personnel? So it puts additional kind of strains in Ukrainian-Chinese relations, which are not, of course, good because of China is close to Russia, and China, for instance, doesn't say the war in Ukraine. It says the Ukrainian crisis. When China says that it supports, when asked about whether do you you support Ukrainian territorial integrity? China answers, we support territorial integrity of all countries, kind of vaguely avoiding name Ukraine, or vaguely avoiding to name Ukrainian war, but kind of Ukrainian conflict, speaking in such terms.
Right. And I think also on those bigger terms, just really briefly, I want to get your sense of what Alexander Lukashenko of Belarus has said. He's apparently changing this military posture, looking at what he's quoting as preparing for war, announced rotational mobilization. So what do you make of this? Is this saber-rattling, or is this something more sinister?
No, it's saber-rattling. Lukashenko is under pressure from Putin to join this war. From the day one of this Russian invasion in 2022, Lukashenko has been under enormous pressure from the Kremlin. But he also understands, he provided territory, he provided ability for Russia to target Ukraine with drones and missiles from Belarusian soil. Russian troops invaded northern Ukraine and Chernobyl zone, for instance, from Belarus. But Lukashenko also understands very well, if he sends troops to fight in Ukraine, and if there will be casualties among Belarusian soldiers, it will be the end of his rule. People will rise in Belarus. One thing, when he politically supports Russia and gives ground for Russia to attack Ukraine from Belarus, that's one thing. But if he actually physically, with Belarusian soldiers, if he joins Russian war effort in Ukraine, that will be the end of his rule.
All right, so we'll be watching that closely, but always concerning if something comes out of Belarus that way. Well, we'll close it there. Thank you so much. Always a pleasure having you. Rostyslav Khotin, thank you so much. Senior editor for the Ukrainian Service, RFE-RL. Thanks.
Thank you, Sasha.
And thank you for watching, but stay right here on TVP World for more news and commentary. Goodbye.